The night air was thick with the musky scent of pine and damp earth as the campers huddled around a flickering fire, each flame dancing like a fleeting memory of light amid encroaching shadows. They had come seeking solace in the wilderness, drawn by the promise of nature's untouched beauty. Yet it wasn't long before the forest whispered of secrets best left unspoken. It began with a distant rustling in the underbrush, a sound that might have been the scurry of a small animal, or perhaps something else entirely. One of the group, a quiet man named Ellis, recalled an old local legend of a wanderer who haunted these woods, doomed to roam between worlds. His voice, trembling with both fear and curiosity, recounted how he had once seen a spectral figure drifting silently among the trees on a cold, moonless night. The others exchanged uneasy glances as the wind seemed to carry echoes of lost voices. Later that night, as the fire dwindled to embers, a sudden gust extinguished the flames, plunging the clearing into darkness. In the pitch-black silence, the group heard soft, deliberate footsteps circling their camp. A woman, Mara, who had ventured slightly away from the group to collect firewood earlier, screamed as she glimpsed a pair of pale, unseeing eyes reflecting the scant light of a dying lantern. In that moment, the forest transformed into a labyrinth of menace. The eyes vanished as abruptly as they had appeared, leaving behind an unsettling emptiness and a collective dread that clutched at every heart. They decided to retreat to their tents, but sleep was elusive. Every creak and rustle was magnified, every whisper of the wind a portent of something sinister. At one point, the low moan of the forest seemed to form words, an unintelligible dirge that spoke of ancient wrongs and unspeakable tragedies. One camper, Ryan, later recalled that he awoke to a cold hand brushing against his cheek, only to find nothing but the lingering smell of earth and decay. Before dawn, the campers attempted to piece together the night's events. Among them was a skeptic named Dana, who insisted that the rational mind must prevail over mere superstition. Yet even she couldn't dismiss the chilling evidence of footprints circling the camp. Prints that were too large, too deliberate, and strangely human in shape, yet not matching any of theirs. As the light of day slowly invaded the clearing, they discovered these prints converging near the edge of the forest, as if something had come to bid farewell, or perhaps to mark them. The trek back to civilization was fraught with eerie silence and the constant feeling of being observed. The once familiar trails seemed to warp and twist under the oppressive weight of the unknown. On the second day, while navigating a narrow path along a steep ravine, a sudden landslide threatened to engulf them. In a frantic scramble for safety, one of the campers, Lucas, slipped and tumbled down, vanishing into the earth with a final cry that was swallowed by the roar of nature. His absence was later confirmed by local searchers who found only a set of footprints leading to an unmarked crevice, as if the forest itself had swallowed him whole. As if Lucas's fate were not enough, their journey led them to an abandoned ranger station hidden deep in the forest. The building, long overtaken by creeping vines and rusting metal, bore silent testimony to tragedies past. Inside, remnants of hastily scribbled journals detailed encounters with a malevolent presence. One entry spoke of a disembodied voice that had lured unsuspecting campers into treacherous bogs and then vanished, leaving behind only despair and broken souls. Another chronicled a night when an entire camp had been paralyzed by a scream that seemed to emanate from every corner of the station, leaving behind an aura of abject terror that lingered long after the screams had ceased. The group pored over the fragile pages, each word a bitter reminder of the forest's dark legacy. They began to understand that the woods were more than a simple backdrop for their adventure. They were a living archive of horrors, collecting the remnants of past tragedies like fallen leaves in the wind. The realization that they were intruding upon a domain where the boundary between life and death was blurred instilled a deep-rooted terror that would not easily be dispelled. That night, under a sky choked with swirling clouds, the campers set up a makeshift camp outside the decrepit ranger station. The wind howled with a mournful tone, carrying with it a faint melody that sounded almost like a lullaby for the lost. Each sound, each rustle of leaves, felt imbued with a malevolent intent. Dana, whose earlier skepticism had begun to falter, found herself gripped by an inexplicable urgency to leave. Yet the invisible chains of dread held her captive in that cursed place. In the dead of night, as the wind subsided to a haunting whisper, The ground beneath them began to tremble. At first, it was a subtle vibration like the distant heartbeat of an ancient creature. But soon, the shaking intensified, shaking the very souls of those who lay awake. The campers huddled together, their eyes wide with horror, as a deep, resonant sound echoed through the forest, an ancient drumbeat that seemed to synchronize with the pulse of the earth. It was as if the forest was summoning its forgotten denizens, reawakening a primordial force that had slumbered for centuries. In the chaos, shadows coalesced into forms that defied natural explanation. Figures emerged, half glimpsed in the corners of vision, faces twisted in silent agony, eyes void of life yet brimming with sorrow. These apparitions moved with an eerie, deliberate grace, as though they were performing a ritual dance of despair. The campers, paralyzed by terror, could only watch as the phantoms circled their temporary refuge, their ethereal presence a stark reminder of the forest's unyielding grip on all who dared enter its domain. In the final moments before the first light of dawn, as if in a cruel twist of fate, the apparitions receded into the depths of the forest, leaving the campers with a silence more oppressive than the darkness itself. When the sun finally rose, its weak rays barely penetrated the dense canopy, illuminating a scene of disarray and loss. Their numbers had dwindled, and the ones who remained bore the indelible marks of a nightmarish ordeal, a haunting knowledge that the forest's malevolence was not something that could be simply outrun or forgotten. As they made their way back to the fringes of civilization, each step was a struggle against an overwhelming urge to never look back. The forest had etched itself into their memories, an ever-present specter that would haunt every subsequent moment of their lives. The horrors they encountered that fateful night were not isolated incidents, but part of a continuum of unspeakable events that had claimed countless souls over the years. In the quiet aftermath, long after the terror had subsided, the survivors were left to grapple with the ineffable truth that sometimes the wild holds more than just the beauty of nature. It harbors the echoes of forgotten nightmares, a relentless reminder that some places are cursed by the weight of their history. And as they retold their tale, each version carried with it the same chilling warning. Never underestimate the darkness that lies beneath the surface of an innocent camping trip, for it may be the gateway to an experience far more horrifying than any earthly terror.
Story number 2.
Rain pounded relentlessly on the old, rusted sedan as Marianne struggled to start the engine on a desolate stretch of highway. The storm had forced her off the main road, and now she found herself on a narrow, unkempt lane leading to an estate that had long been abandoned. With no other choice, she pressed forward, headlights cutting through the driving sheets of rain until she reached a towering, dilapidated mansion looming like a specter in the darkness. Marianne's heart pounded as she parked near a sagging wrought iron gate covered in tangled vines. The mansion's facade was a patchwork of peeling paint and shattered windows, its silent towers reaching upward as if in perpetual agony. With trembling hands, she gathered her meager belongings and stepped into the night, hoping to find shelter and perhaps some form of assistance. The air inside the grounds was cold and heavy, and every step Marianne took seemed to echo unnaturally in the vast, empty courtyard. As she approached the grand entrance, the heavy wooden doors creaked open at her touch, revealing a cavernous entry hall bathed in the faint glow of lightning. Dust motes danced in the beams of light that broke through cracks in the boarded-up windows, lending the space an eerie, otherworldly quality. Inside, the silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant drip of water and the occasional creak of the ancient structure settling into the night. Marianne's footsteps echoed as she navigated a maze of corridors lined with faded portraits whose eyes seemed to follow her every move. A chill raced down her spine with each passing moment, as if unseen eyes were scrutinizing her presence. Drawn by a mix of desperation and curiosity, Marianne explored deeper into the mansion. She discovered a library whose shelves bowed under the weight of dusty tomes and yellowed manuscripts. Among the scattered pages was a journal bound in cracked leather, its entries written in a hurried, almost frantic hand. The journal recounted the tragic fate of the estate's former inhabitants, a family that had vanished without a trace under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind whispers of curses, unholy rituals, and a malevolence that festered within the mansion's very walls. As Marianne read, the temperature in the room plummeted. The hairs on her neck stood on end when a soft, rhythmic tapping began somewhere behind the rows of decaying books. Heart pounding, she crept towards the sound, only to find an old grandfather clock standing solemnly in a shadowed corner. Its pendulum swung slowly, its tick-tock punctuating the silence like a heartbeat that was no longer her own. Yet tapping persisted, irregular and deliberate, as if something unseen was trying to communicate through the language of time. A sudden gust of wind slammed a nearby door shut, and the journal fell open to a page describing a secret chamber hidden behind a false wall in the mansion's east wing. According to the journal, this room had been used in unspeakable rituals meant to bind a restless spirit to the house. The spirit, described as a sorrowful, tormented figure, was said to appear when the boundary between the living and the dead was at its thinnest. Though apprehension warred with the need to understand her surroundings, Marianne felt compelled to seek out this hidden room. Clutching the journal as her only guide, she ascended a creaking staircase that led to the east wing. The corridor was narrow, its walls adorned with cracked mirrors reflecting fragmented images of her face, distorted by time and decay. At the far end of the hallway, an ornate mirror hung askew, its reflective surface marred by deep scratches. As Marianne approached, she noticed that the frame of the mirror was different from the others. Etched into the wood were strange symbols that pulsed faintly in the flickering light of her flashlight. With trembling fingers, she pressed against the mirror. For a moment, it seemed to give way, shifting aside as though it were a door itself. Behind it lay a small hidden chamber, cloaked in darkness and the heavy scent of damp earth. Inside, the room was barren except for a circular stone altar at its center. The altar was stained with age-old marks that hinted at rituals of binding and despair. As Marianne stepped closer, she felt a sudden surge of energy, a palpable presence that pressed upon her mind with unspoken words and silent commands. In that moment, a shadow moved in the corner of her eye, a vague, shifting form that disappeared as soon as she turned to look. The air in the chamber grew thick and oppressive, and Marianne's heart thundered in her chest. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, she heard a low, mournful wail reverberating through the walls. It was not a sound of anger or malice, but of deep, aching sorrow that resonated with the darkness of the room. Marianne's rational mind fought to make sense of what was happening. The journal had warned of a spirit bound to this place, a ghost who was a prisoner of its own torment. But the emotion behind the wail was so intense, so raw, that it shattered any pretense of logical thought. Trembling, she reached out to touch the cold, rough surface of the altar. The moment her fingers brushed the stone, she was overwhelmed by a sudden vision, a cascade of fragmented memories not her own. She saw a young woman in a flowing dress, her face contorted by grief as she pleaded for release from a fate she could not escape. Shadows swirled around her, and unseen forces tore at the edges of reality. Marianne felt herself drawn into the vision, as if the spirit's sorrow was bleeding into her own soul. The boundaries between her existence and that of the tortured specter blurred, leaving her disoriented and vulnerable. A sharp, echoing knock broke the spell, jolting Marianne back to the present. The sound seemed to emanate from the very walls of the mansion, each knock resonating with the weight of centuries of despair. With a sense of dread mounting in her chest, she stepped away from the altar and hurried out of the chamber, the journal clutched tightly in her hand as if it were a lifeline. As she retraced her steps through the eerie corridors, the mansion appeared to shift around her. Familiar hallways became labyrinthine, and the very walls seemed to whisper her name. A cacophony of disembodied voices began to swell, a chorus of lamentations, each one echoing a story of loss and longing. Marianne's breath came in short, panicked gasps as she realized that the mansion was not merely a building, but a living repository of souls trapped in eternal sorrow. Outside, the storm had abated into a cold drizzle, and the once impenetrable night was now pierced by a weak, ghostly light. The mansion's exterior, shrouded in mist, looked less menacing from a distance, yet its secrets remained intact. Marianne burst through the heavy front doors, stumbling into the overgrown courtyard where the silence of the night pressed in around her. The oppressive presence of the mansion seemed to follow her, as if it were unwilling to let go of its captive anytime soon. In the distance, she heard a soft, rhythmic tapping, a reminder of the grandfather clock and the relentless passage of time. It was as though the mansion itself was calling her back, urging her to embrace the darkness that had become a part of her. With no safe haven in sight and the memory of the journal's warnings etched into her mind, Marianne turned away from the estate and set off down the unkempt road, her steps hurried and unsteady. Yet even as she made her escape, Marianne could not shake the feeling that the mansion's sorrowful spirit had imprinted itself upon her. In the quiet moments before sleep, claimed her that night in a small roadside motel, she would awaken to a faint sound, a soft tapping at the edge of her consciousness, echoing the lament of the lost soul in the hidden chamber. And sometimes, when the wind was just right, she would swear she heard a distant mournful wail, a reminder that some places are haunted not only by the past but by the very essence of despair itself. Marianne's life would never be the same again. In every shadow, every creak of a floorboard, and every whispered echo of a bygone tragedy, she could feel the relentless pull of that forsaken mansion. The boundaries between her memories and the mansion's dark legacy blurred with each passing day, and the sorrowful spirit seemed to linger in every corner of her mind. No matter how far she traveled, no matter how many miles lay between her and that night, the haunting refrain of the mansion's lament would follow her. A chilling reminder that some horrors are not confined to a single place, but live on within us, whispering their secrets in the silence of our hearts.
Story number 3.
The night was unnaturally still as Daniel drove the winding country road toward the derelict asylum that locals whispered about with fearful reverence. The building, once a sanctuary for troubled souls, now loomed like a monolith of despair under a sky shrouded in heavy, low-hanging clouds. Its crumbling facade and shattered windows seemed to watch him approach, as if the eyes of its past inhabitants were waiting for his arrival. Daniel had always been drawn to places steeped in mystery and tragedy, and this abandoned asylum was the epitome of both. With a trembling hand, he switched off his headlights and stepped out of his car, the gravel crunching underfoot like a warning. The cold wind carried a faint, metallic scent, an odor of decay and forgotten torment that tightened his chest with each breath. He pushed open the rusted iron gate, its groan echoing in the silence, and made his way along a narrow, overgrown path. The asylum's main entrance yawned before him, dark and uninviting, its heavy door hanging askew on rusted hinges. Every step he took felt weighted by unseen eyes, as if the very air was saturated with memories of sorrow and pain. Inside, the corridors were long and labyrinthine, their peeling walls and stained floors bearing silent testimony to years of neglect. Dust danced in the sparse beams of his flashlight, each mote a tiny reminder of the countless secrets that had decayed within these walls. As he ventured deeper, the oppressive atmosphere thickened, and whispers seemed to echo just beyond the edge of hearing, a murmur of voices speaking in a language of anguish and regret. Daniel's footsteps slowed when he entered what had once been the common room. Broken furniture lay scattered like forgotten relics, and the remnants of hastily scribbled notes were scrawled on walls now mottled with water stains. His flashlight beam landed on a tattered calendar, its dates long past, marked with cryptic annotations that hinted at the suffering of those who had once called this place home. A sudden, soft rustling drew his attention toward a doorway shrouded in darkness. The sound was almost imperceptible, like the breath of a dying whisper, yet it sent a shiver down his spine. Despite every instinct urging him to turn back, curiosity compelled him forward. He edged closer, the beam of his flashlight trembling as it swept over an ancient porcelain doll lying face down on the floor. Its cracked features and glassy eyes gave it an eerie semblance of life, a silent sentinel to the horrors that had unfolded here. As Daniel knelt to examine the doll, the temperature around him plummeted. A chill, like the icy grip of a long-dead hand, crawled up his arm. The whispering voices grew louder, coalescing into a mournful dirge that reverberated through the room. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, a figure began to materialize in the corner of his vision, a pale, gaunt silhouette that glided silently toward him. Its eyes, dark and hollow, seemed to pierce through the veil of time, locking onto his with a silent plea for recognition. Frozen in terror, Daniel could only watch as the specter moved with a sorrowful grace, its transparent form flickering like a dying flame. In that moment, the whispers resolved into words, agonized pleas and bitter regrets that spoke of confinement, betrayal, and unspeakable cruelty. The ghostly figure extended a translucent hand, beckoning him to follow deeper into the labyrinth of forgotten rooms. Though every instinct screamed to flee, Daniel found himself unable to resist. The apparition led him down a narrow corridor where the walls bore deep scratches and symbols that looked disturbingly like claw marks. The corridor seemed to stretch on endlessly, its end obscured by a dense, suffocating darkness that pulsed with an almost malevolent life of its own. At the corridor's end lay a small chamber, the door barely clinging to its frame. Inside, remnants of a life long extinguished lay scattered, a rusted bed frame, a broken mirror reflecting fragmented images, and on the floor, a single, dusty diary. Daniel picked up the diary, its pages brittle and stained with what looked like dried blood. The entries were a chaotic tapestry of despair and defiance, written by someone who had once sought refuge in the asylum's grim confines. The words spoke of a relentless tormentor, a figure that had preyed on the vulnerable, binding their souls with promises of eternal suffering. A piercing shriek shattered the oppressive silence, echoing through the chamber like the wail of the damned. The diary fell from Daniel's grasp as he staggered back, his heart hammering in his chest. The ghostly figure reappeared in the doorway, its mournful eyes now filled with anguish and fury. In a sudden, desperate moment, the specter pointed to a set of iron bars that led to a small, locked room in the far corner of the chamber. Driven by an inexplicable compulsion, Daniel approached the cell. The air around the bars was thick with despair, and as he peered inside, he saw a flickering candle illuminating a confined space cluttered with remnants of personal belongings. Tattered photographs, a rusted key, and a faded scarf. Something about the cell spoke of a life abruptly halted, a spirit confined not only by iron, but by a cruel twist of fate. Before he could react, the rusted key clattered to the floor as if dropped by an unseen hand. Daniel's pulse quickened as he picked it up, the cold metal sending a shiver through him. The ghostly figure hovered near the cell door, its gaze imploring him to use the key. With trembling hands, he inserted the key into the lock. The click of the tumblers echoed like a death knell as the door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Without hesitation, Daniel stepped down the creaking steps. The air grew heavier with each step, and a foul stench of decay invaded his senses. At the bottom of the stairs, he found himself in a subterranean chamber lined with small cells, each one empty, yet echoing with the memories of tortured souls. In the center of the room, an altar stood, its surface etched with symbols that pulsed faintly in the dim light, a macabre tableau of ritualistic despair. As he moved closer to the altar, the chamber trembled with a sudden, violent gust of wind that extinguished his flashlight. Plunged into total darkness, Daniel's mind raced with terror and disbelief. In the silence that followed, the faint sound of dripping water and the scrape of unseen claws filled his ears. The presence of the asylum seemed to tighten around him, a malignant force determined to draw him into its depths of madness. Then, out of the blackness, a voice, hoarse, pained, and utterly human, whispered his name. Daniel, it breathed, each syllable laden with sorrow. The sound was so near that he felt the exhalation on his skin. Panic surged through him as he fumbled for his flashlight, its beam finally piercing the darkness and revealing a scene that defied explanation. The walls of the chamber were no longer mere stone. They were alive with shifting shadows that mimicked the anguished faces of those long forgotten. The altar began to glow with an eerie, pulsing light, and the diary in his hand flipped open on its own, as if guided by an invisible force. The pages revealed a final, desperate plea, a warning that the asylum's evil was not just a remnant of the past, but a living, breathing horror that fed on fear and despair. In that moment, Daniel realized the true nature of the asylum. It was not simply a building abandoned to time, but a prison for lost souls. A vessel for an ancient malevolence that thrived on the suffering of those who dared disturb its rest. The ghostly figure materialized before him once more, this time with an expression of desperate sorrow. It reached out, not in menace, but as if begging for salvation from an endless cycle of torment. The chilling revelation surged through Daniel like a cold wave. He had become part of the asylum's narrative, a new chapter in its book of despair. With the oppressive weight of dread crushing him, he turned to flee back up the staircase. But the corridors had changed. The layout twisted into an impossible maze that confounded his every step. The anguished voices grew louder, mingling with the sound of his frantic footsteps and ragged breaths. In a final, desperate attempt to escape, Daniel sprinted through the labyrinth, the ghostly apparitions flitting just out of sight, their mournful wails urging him onward. The building itself seemed to resist his flight, its walls closing in like a tomb, trapping him in a cycle of terror from which there was no escape. Every door he opened led to another dead end, every corridor another echo of his mounting despair. Just as the crushing realization of his fate threatened to engulf him entirely, a single beam of pale moonlight broke through a cracked window at the end of a narrow hall. Clinging to that fragile hope, Daniel dashed toward it, the cold, spectral hands of the asylum reaching for him from every shadow. With one final burst of adrenaline, he burst through the window into the night. Outside, the asylum loomed behind him, its dark silhouette a stark reminder of the horror he had left behind. Daniel's heart pounded as he ran along the overgrown path, the oppressive voices and spectral eyes fading into the distance. Yet as the asylum receded into the darkness, he knew its mark was forever imprinted on his soul, a lingering curse that would haunt every quiet moment of his life. And even as dawn broke over the horizon, promising a new day, Daniel could not shake the overwhelming certainty that somewhere, behind the facade of normalcy, the asylum still waited. Its ancient, malignant presence would forever be a part of him, a whispered echo of despair in the silence of every night.